So I appreciate everyone being here. I like that this is a small group because it means like we can actually just like discuss together, which will be fun. So how many folks here know about the shutdown of USAID? Cool. Can anyone tell me a little bit about what happened? Let's start. Alexis, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can start since I was in the agency at the time. I want to say inauguration day was January 20th. And I want to say it was maybe the day after that or that week. There was a stop work put on all USAID programs. And we kind of thought it was just going to be like it had been before, where we pause, reflect, and then we get back to work. Then a couple weeks later, it was there were Doge people showing up in the Ronald Reagan building, and we were all put on kind of a gag order, so we weren't allowed to speak to anybody about what was going on. And then maybe a couple of weeks after that, we got the news that we needed to get on planes and get back to the US within 72 hours. That then was lifted to make it a few weeks. And then that then shifted to closing out all of the operations by August 9th, I believe.
Anyone tell me about what USAID was doing? Like why it was there, what kind of programs they ran?
They were focused on development, democracy, a lot of, just global development and getting many other countries stable, say.
Correctly, weren't a lot of them also focused particularly on global health?
Yes, there were a lot of global health programs. That was, if you look at the biggest accounts, it was humanitarian aid, global health, and then economic development. Anyone else have something they want to add? So the part that kind of hits me about shutting down USAID is that you had a few people in the room who one day they get up and they make the conscious decision to shut off food and medicine and other life-saving care to 120 million people across the world. And they do it with no plan in place, with no idea of who's going to fill the backstop, with no idea of any of what comes next. They just say, we're doing this wrong, and so all of it is shutting down immediately. And so, you literally have projects that are midway. You have people that are getting treatment right in the middle of treatment being, asked, all right, no more. You had warehouses full of food, and instead of distributing the food, we just let the food rot. Like everything was so unplanned and uncoordinated. And since then, the best estimate is that over 1 million people have died as a result of those cuts. And that's pretty predictable. I mean, you're providing food and medicine to people, and then you stop doing that, and there's no one else there that's going to take your place. People are going to die. It's kind of just a reality. Does anyone have any questions about that, about kind of what we were doing, about why? Yeah.
Is there any, I guess probably not, but is there any form of have other countries or even international institutions pressured the government to actually think about, because I think what you just said is really powerful. It speaks to a lot more of the human side of things that just kind of got politicized really quickly. But I wonder, is there any way that, I guess accountability is a really slippery term, but is there any sort of pressure, or are there any kind of or is the US government facing any external pressure that said hey, you guys actually have to do the right thing, be a contributing member of a global community?
I wish there was more pressure like that. What we've seen other countries do is kind of follow in the US's footsteps. So Europe has similarly cut most of their aid in half, most countries in Europe. The UK has also been cutting their foreign aid budget. What was essentially happening is that, US aid started in 1962. Even before that, we had the Marshall Plan providing major foreign aid to Europe. We kind of were trendsetters that this was the right thing to do, that foreign aid was an important part of US foreign policy, and that other countries should go along with us in doing this. And so when the US cut off foreign aid and, we were all this rhetoric against foreign aid, meanwhile, we're also pushing on our NATO allies to increase their military spending, and to take more responsibility for their own national defense. What the UK and a lot of other countries did was they moved their foreign aid money to military spending. And so at the same time that the US was cutting off humanitarian and development aid, other countries were as well. The only country that's really been increasing their foreign aid since the US shut off is China. They've been rapidly increasing it, and they've actually gone so far as to directly replace projects that we were doing. So for instance, we had a project in Cambodia where we were getting rid of mines that we had lain during the Vietnam War. And those were mines that were still there and were still a risk to children in the country. And so we were doing this humanitarian effort to demine Cambodia. And we stopped doing that project when USAID was shut down. And China came in and was like, all right, we'll start demining your country. And so now China's continuing that project. And there's a lot of other examples like that across the world where, China was like, all right, you're doing this right. You're clearly forming a strong alliance with Cambodia or whatever country it is. We will literally come in and replace this project, and we'll be the partner of choice. Now, that funding from China is not enough to fill in the US gaps. 1 million people have still died. And if you look at what China's foreign aid looks like, it's a lot more focused on big infrastructure projects, big buildings, things that are flashy, not necessarily like saving children from hunger and disease. But either way, they're kind of the sole power right now that is sort of filling in some of these gaps at grave risk to US national security. Anyone have any thoughts, questions about that? Yeah.
Yeah, are there any discussions in US policy circles about the likely implications for drug resistance? Like that seems like a really big likely problem that's gonna come back to the US as a result of this in terms of like tuberculosis and HIV.
Yeah. I haven't heard congressional staff talking about that much. I think they should talk about that. If you want to put together a report on it, we send out a newsletter to congressional staff every 2 weeks. I'll include it in the next one. Yeah, that's a conversation that should be happening more. Likewise, there was an Ebola outbreak in the DRC and they only had 10% of the needed funding to respond to it. And so it really is only a matter of time before Ebola or the next COVID or whatever the next global pandemic's going to be spreads to the United States, because we're simply just not spending the money to contain that sort of thing. Now, of course, COVID spread to the US during USAID being here. So our kind of disease prevention architecture is not perfect. But at least when you're making an effort, like that is worthwhile. And, we contained bird flu. We've contained Ebola multiple times. When you're making an effort to contain these diseases, that is important. And it definitely saves money in the long term and avoids things becoming, drug resistant and mutating and all sorts of other problems. Yeah.
Yeah, so that China has stepped in, but mostly prioritizing infrastructure projects and that kind of thing. What is the reason they are focusing on things like global health that could also impact them, same way it impacts the US? Do you have a sense of what they're moving? Yeah.
Knowing that one. Alexis, do you have any ideas there?
Sorry, what?
Like why China doesn't prioritize global health?
So China's development strategy is focused primarily on loans as well. And they ask for collateral to be put up and for those loans. And so you can't really give up collateral, right, when you're asking for like help on health things. And they will collect if you don't pay. And they have collected. They own a port now, I believe, or have 99-year access to a port I can't remember what country that defaulted on a loan, a development loan that, to them. But, and I think there's another country that's about to develop that, and Jordan is actually taking them to court to try to get out of one of their development agreements as well. But global health is not, yeah, so that's, it hasn't been a priority of theirs, at all, that I've seen.
Yeah, and I mean, the argument of China taking our place is definitely very persuasive to lawmakers, especially on the Republican side of the aisle. So when we go in to talk with lawmakers, that's a point that we make pretty clearly, and depending on the office, more clearly than others, just to say that, like, listen, this is about US influence. This is about our ability to project power overseas, and you're directly seeing them take our place. And that starts to stick depending on the office. So I could switch gears here to kind of talk about our advocacy efforts, but I don't want to leave the policy conversation early. So does anyone else have any thoughts, ideas about, like, what should our foreign aid look like? What kind of reforms should we make? What problems were there? Because there's definitely, like, valid criticism of US foreign aid, like very valid. Yeah.
This isn't something that like I know a whole lot about, but I do wonder, because I've heard it before, where like sometimes like how are we operating in terms of like providing foreign support, but in a way that's like culturally sensitive and not trying to feel like Americans coming into like another community that we don't probably understand culturally, or maybe we have certain biases coming in. Like, how does that look? Is there like a training that people have to do, or is there like how do you guys build that cultural sensitivity before you go into another country?
Do you understand?
Yeah, so USAID's approach was that the majority of our staff were actually local hires. So they were citizens of the countries that we're working in. So they provided that local context. They provided that cultural relevancy to the programs that we had. And quite honestly, these were some of the smartest, best trained individuals in those countries. And, they are phenomenal. And a lot of them would be working, for USAID for 10, 20, 30, 40 years even. So they understood the USAID as an institution, but they also understood the country that within which we're working. And so that's what we relied on to provide that context.
And I think that's an important point too when it comes to US soft power. Like, USAID was employing hundreds of thousands of people across the world. So now you really have a situation where not only can a family and a village and a government directly say the US let a child starve and let many children starve, they can also say the United States, just immediately fired tens of thousands of people in our country. And so you get a situation where people are just really angry, and to some degree, rightfully so, at the United States, because, when you're the aid provider for a very long time, 70 years, and you just suddenly leave and you have no backstop in place and you're letting people die for no reason, people are going to hate you. I mean, so we don't even know what the full impact of this is going to be yet, in terms of terrorism, in terms of the US military not being able to operate abroad, in terms of the next time we need a trade agreement signed, or the next time we need a favor from any country we were providing aid to across the world, them just saying F you. I mean, like, that's the reality here. Like, that's what we said to them. And so why aren't they going to say the same thing back to us? Yeah.
I can just add a personal story here. So I was a U.S. Department of State Foreign Service officer serving in Islamabad, Pakistan at the time USAID fell. I remember the entire embassy had a town hall, something like, I think we were close to 500 Americans and local staff across the embassy. And the ambassador came in, made the announcement. And you can imagine the faces of the local staff who were so shocked and appalled by the lack of information they had about what was essentially their entire livelihoods, the past 10, 20 plus years of their career, which had been spent working for the US government, many of whom were eligible had USAID not shut down to potentially immigrate to the United States for their dedication to the US government. So you can imagine like those people were now without a livelihood for their families. They were fighting for the few jobs remaining at the US Embassy, which were essentially just administratively shutting down USAID. And now many of those people are without employment in their home countries. So just wanted to add that personal story.
So yeah, I mean, it was pretty awful. And the consequences of that in terms of diseases getting to the U.S., in terms of U.S. national security, in terms of alliances, in terms of trade. I mean, the other thing to realize here is that 13 out of 15 of the U.S.'s largest trading partners were once recipients of foreign aid. So South Korea in the 40s and 50s, 20% of their entire GDP was foreign aid primarily from the U.S. They had a hunger crisis in their country. And this is one of the most like developed and like best economies in the world today. South Korea, one of our closest trading partners, they were facing mass famine conditions. And we were there for them. We helped, get them through that, avoid famine. We also provided major development aid. We also signed trade agreements. And like, sure enough, their economy grew. And they're now one of our closest trading partners. That has happened with a lot of countries across the world. I mean, pretty much all of Europe, recipient of the Marshall Plan, and then got out of that like economically dire situation and is now working with the United States. And, even like countries that people say, oh, they're never going to develop. I mean, global poverty, extreme global poverty has decreased in half over the past 30 years. And I think that conversation is like not had enough that like we are making progress. Like, countries really are moving in the right direction. And that's because in part in trade and aid and all of these sort of relationships. And we're going to see a lot of that collapse in the next few years. So a lot of that progress that we were making against hunger and poverty and disease just sort of fall apart, completely out of our hands. The other thing to emphasize here for anyone who's like, all right, I get that this foreign aid thing's important, but why not spend the money domestically? So how much were we spending on USAID? I want someone to give me a guess and not someone who like knows the answer for sure. All right, someone who knows the answer for sure. Yeah. 0.3. So even less than that. I mean, it's nothing. It's a rounding error. This is like the smallest budget item you could possibly think of. 1 penny out of every 3 taxpayer dollars. That is not the kind of money that is going to solve any sort of issue in the United States. It's also a drop in the bucket when it comes to the DoD's budget. DoD's budget, 22%, the U.S. federal budget. USAID, 0.3. So you have to kind of cost benefit analysis here. What soft power, what countering of terrorism, what alliances were we getting for 0.3% of the budget? And now the administration's like, we need to increase our defense spending to 1.5 trillion a year. And like, you're wondering, okay, so we're going to rapidly increase the defense budget. We're not getting this money back domestically. We're not paying down the deficit. We're going to rapidly increase our defense budget at the same time that the US is pulling out soft power. So the entire world is going to see a situation where we're rapidly building up our military, while at the same time, we're cutting off humanitarian and development aid and we're letting their people starve. Like, that's a really, really bad image. I mean, that's like a country on a warpath. That's not the type of country that anyone wants to work with. And so you think about US national security in the long term, you think about like our troops being safe and not being put in harm's way. That is not a situation that you want. Like, that does not look good for anyone. Any thoughts? Yeah.
Do you think it would take, given the combination of those two factors, like looking forward more optimistically to revise that image and actually make these countries agree to work with us again in a way that's sustainable?
I think we rapidly need to increase our humanitarian and development aid to beyond the budget that it was at. I think 0.3% of the federal budget is ridiculous. I think it should be significantly higher. And I think we should aggressively respond to issues like climate change and hunger and poverty. And we should show, especially in the next administration, that we can be an ally, that this was a blip, that that the United States is back and we're doing things better than we have before. Because we definitely weren't perfect, but like, let's do the good that we were doing. Let's expand on that.
But first, two related questions. First, what is Republican sentiment outside of the administration, if you have a sense of that? And then also, what is the prospects for how quickly these policies could be reversed by a subsequent presidential administration?
Yeah, so Republican sentiment's interesting. Republicans are very supportive of foreign aid. The best polling done by McLaughlin, that's actually known as President Trump's bolster, says 72% of Republicans support international assistance. At the same time, only 10% of Republicans support USAID. So there's a bit of a disconnect there, and I see this disconnect when I talk to people because, like, I was talking to a rabbi yesterday, and I was like, we cut off food to people. And he was like, well, I didn't know that. I thought USAID was just corrupt and no one cared about it. And he was very against cutting off food to people, but he also didn't like USAID. And it was like a discussion to explain why USAID was giving food to people. And so I think in the public communication battle, yes, the national security points are important, but those are a little more complicated. And I really see that as like, the policy people, let's explain that all in depth. If we could just get the general public to understand it is less than 1% of the budget, and USAID saved 90 million lives over the past 2 decades, and they distribute food and medicine abroad, and all of those charities that you donate to, Save the Children, World Vision, Catholic Relief Services. Catholic Relief Services receive $4 billion from USAID every year. And like, you wonder why there isn't this like Christian and Catholic response to all of this. Like literally the nonprofits that they donate to have been completely defunded and are laying off like much of their staff. And so if we can just explain that really basic case, like those nonprofits you see on TV, they're cutting off money to them. Like that alone would help like change public opinion and where we are in these issues.
You mentioned that support for USAID is at 10%. Is this a recent thing or is this a long-term kind of trend? Like this, is this something that really after Musk came in and did what he did, like suddenly Republicans turned, or was this kind of building for a long time, this anti-USAID?
Very, very sudden turn. And Musk spent a lot of money and used Twitter, a platform that he controlled, to like push this propaganda. So Republican administrations historically were more in favor of USAID funding than Democratic administrations because they understood the national security case. And so like Bush was one of the biggest fans of USAID. He created PEPFAR. He created the President's Malaria Initiative. He loved what we were doing overseas with USAID and, drastically expanded their budget. So this was really something sudden. This was a poll done in November of last year. It's distressing to see that. On the other side, it's nice to see that 72% support international assistance. So, perhaps when done under the State Department or we create a new agency with a different name, they'll support it. But, we have to do the makeover, create the new name, etc. So I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing to try to create the future of foreign aid, restore USAID with a different name, what have you. So one are constituent meetings. How many people here have met with their member of Congress or member of their staff? Yeah, go Neil. I know Alexis has to. Anyone? Yeah, stand up. Anyone else has? Okay. So does anyone know the process of like doing that? Anyone know that's like an option? Yeah.
It's in Washington.
You can walk into their office in DC. You have to fly to the Capitol to do that. The easiest way to do it is literally just email their scheduler or other members of their staff, and just request a meeting. And you can do a 15-minute virtual meeting. Often the member of the Congress themselves, especially if it's a member of the House, will attend because they want to hear from their constituents. And not that many people know that process. Not that many people reach out to them and request time to talk. Even fewer people reach out about foreign aid. Foreign aid's known as an issue with no constituency. It's like, who really cares about people starving overseas? Well, who's really going to go out of their way? Who's going to take time to take a stand on that issue? Because, it doesn't necessarily, there's people that there's nonprofits, there's farmers in the US that was distributing their food overseas. There is a little bit of an industry of foreign aid in the United States, but it's not to the same degree as them shutting down USDA funding. And so this is an issue where if Congress is going to care about it, it's going to take members of the general public, people that don't necessarily have such a personal stake, but can understand this is important, maybe because they have family overseas, or maybe because they just have a heart to go out of their way and meet with members of Congress and to personally lobby on this issue. And I'll say that our lobbying efforts over the past year have been really successful. So I run the Alliance for American Leadership. We're a nonprofit. Over the past year, we've organized 750 meetings with members of Congress and their staff. And we did that primarily on the Republican side of the aisle. And the thing about it is it eventually starts to make an impact. So last week, Congress passed a bill, SFOPS, HR 7006, that restores $50 billion for diplomacy, humanitarian aid, development programs. Now, that is almost the budget that we had for foreign aid prior to the USAID shutdown. The bad news is that we no longer have the infrastructure in place, USAID, to actually implement those funds. Also, this administration is famous for seeing Congress appropriate funds and then completely ignoring those funds and just refusing to spend the money. And so there's a lot of oversight work that we're doing and that has to happen, and legal work that has to happen to make sure the administration actually spends this money and to make sure they actually spend it well. And it's not just like a $40 billion check to Argentina or something. So there is a lot of work that has to happen. But when you see, the vast majority of members of Congress support this legislation, support foreign aid, that is hopeful. That is like a step in the right direction. And you can say to yourself, okay, we were lobbying on this for the past year. We were working really, really hard, and we're starting to see the impact come back to us a little bit. And, I think next year we can see an even bigger budget for foreign aid come through, and eventually we can start putting in the reforms and the architecture to actually implement these programs well again, and even to implement them better than they were under USAID. Does anyone have any questions about that? Yeah.
Yes. Does this money, these 50 billion, are they going to the State Department, or I was reading that, some of the, responsibilities, they call it, of USAID, and especially infrastructure, were actually being managed by other agencies as well, not just State Department. And so I'm wondering how this money is actually being distributed.
It's primarily through state. They moved some programs to USDA. And, commerce and others have a role to play too, but most of the money is now going through state.
Is there a concern that bills like this were passed under the assumption that the money actually wouldn't get to where it needed to go? Like they're just kind of saying, yeah, we'll vote for that because it looks good and we're starting to feel pressure to do the right thing there, but not actually being concerned about the follow through? Or is there, you think, actual support for reestablishment of those structures?
I think there's actual support. And, in the meetings that we've had, we had a lot of meetings with Lindsey Graham's staff and other key appropriators, people that were authoring this legislation, and they support this bill. They want to see the money spent. I think Lindsey Graham's a great example of someone, you go back a few years, he's calling for doubling the budget of USAID. And, he was kind of quiet and flipped a bit right when USAID was being taken down because he's, has a Republican primary challenger this year and he's concerned about that. But now that everything is a little quieter and now that this $50 billion bill, I'm sure, very few people have read about it here and even fewer in the general public have. Now that everything's a bit quieter, he's willing to vote the way and, write legislation the way that he wants to write it again. And so that's what you see a lot right now on the Republican side of the aisle. Like in a quiet moment, and when it really comes to policy, a lot of these people are willing to do the right thing. They're just not going to do it publicly. And when, the shit's hit the fan and when everything is like really bad on Twitter, they're not going to do the right thing. But when everything calms down a bit, now we're seeing them move in the direction that they were at for decades.
For the students that are here, for global development students who are probably, kind of trying to figure out how to make a career or develop their own skills now in this post USAID world. I like that you said that this is an opportunity to build something better than what USAID was. But I'm curious, and I think they'd probably like to hear this too. How do you keep yourself going when you have to retread ground that has already been tread and demonstrably worked for delivering this aid to now rebuild all of that again? Well, for seemingly no reason. How do you keep yourself going?
It's depressing at times, but sometimes you have hope. So like yesterday, Alexia's held, or her mother held like a little like party for the whole international development, community in Atlanta. And it was like 20 of us, and we were all kind of sharing stories, and we were together, and we felt like so motivated to keep this advocacy going and to not only restore what we once had, but to build it back and to reform it so it works more effectively. Because everyone at USAID knew there were problems there. And so I think like when you're at conversations like that and you're with people like that, you start to feel like things can turn in a better direction. And, like the people around you keep you going forward. I would also say more on the career question. So does anyone here want to work on Capitol Hill, like for a member of Congress? Okay. So I would say the best way to work for a member of Congress to get a job working for them is to lobby a member of Congress. That's how I got like an internship working for one back in the day. I was lobbying on behalf of presidential libraries because you get to meet staff, you get to know staff, and they start to realize that you put together good policy briefs and that you're a good hire. Does anyone here want to work in the Foreign Service at like USAID, when it comes back, or the State Department, anything like that? So a good way to like set up working in that field is to meet people in that field and to be a voice in how USAID gets rebuilt. So I mentioned that, party that we had yesterday, 20 people there, all were some of like the leaders at USAID who now want to work together to do the advocacy to rebuild this agency. And I asked everyone there, we have a lot of students and young people who intern and volunteer at the Alliance for American Leadership. Would you be willing to mentor someone that works here? And, everyone was like, yes, of course I would. Like, please tell me this young person who cares about foreign assistance and is willing to take this fight forward. And the thing is that when you work side by side with these USAID Foreign Service officers, it's not only that, they're kind of mentoring you and they're motivating you, but you're also kind of motivating them because they want to see that there are people outside of the Foreign Service community that care about these issues, that, the public is not going to let these things die, that the next generation is not going to just let this all fall apart with no complaint whatsoever. So if you would like to apply for an internship at the Alliance for American Leadership, I would definitely encourage you to. Our interns kind of do a number of things, and I'll break through each of those categories. One, everyone meets with their member of Congress and their senators. We want you to do a district meeting with them. We want you to do a virtual DC meeting with them. We want you to meet with them repeatedly, and we want you to get friends to meet with them too. But two, you also specialize in really an area of interest to you. So one's the legislative side. I mentioned that bill that passed. The bill and the authorizing language for that bill is over 200 pages. We have to go through and create a calendar of every single reporting requirement in that legislation. Then we have to follow up with key staffers on key committees and say, have you received this report yet? Can you send us the report? Can we read the report? That's the way this bill is going to be implemented. That's the way this money is going to be spent. Someone has to take the time to do that. And the interns, as well as the foreign service officers on our team, are the people that read that legislation and put together those policy briefs and put together the articles that we send to congressional staff, the biweekly newsletter that we send a list of 10,000 staffers every 2 weeks, the follow-ups that we send after meetings, how we keep staffers informed of all of these issues. That is a lot of research and writing work that has to happen, and that really makes a big impact on what the future of these programs look like and if they're funded at all. Second side is communications. We run social media accounts, TikTok, Instagram, LinkedIn. We also have a Substack page with 40,000 subscribers, all donors to our organization and similar organizations like ours. And so, if you want to write like the blog post that is going to mobilize $1,000 for the Alliance, and our average blog post mobilizes about that much, that's something that you can do. And, telling these stories to that list of 40,000 people and, many more people online about what were the impact of these programs. Why do we care about these programs at Georgia Tech? What's the impact on the peanut farmers here in Georgia that, lost funding when USAID was shut down? We were taking peanuts grown here in Georgia, turning that into a paste and, giving that to starving children overseas. Like, talking through the impact of these programs is important. And it raises money for our organization, which allows us to make campaign contributions to members of Congress and to continue the work that we do. But it also just educates the public about these issues. And then the final side of our work is the campaign side. So we are a political action committee. Does anyone know what a PAC is? Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, it's like an act that's kind of like a little bit similar to an interest group, but you guys kind of have more power to actually influence Congress, right?
Yeah. So why do we have more power though?
Because it's more of a formalized committee.
Yes. So formalized
organization.
Formalized organization, and we donate directly to members of Congress. So, they have to raise money for their campaigns. Very little of that money actually comes from interest groups. The majority just comes from dedicated Democrats or Republicans. So you would be surprised, $5,000 for a key member of a key committee sways votes. Like, really is extremely significant when it comes to whether these programs get funded and to what degree they get funded. Likewise, we provide volunteer support. So has anyone phone banked or canvassed before for a candidate for anything? Nice. So we do that, but we do it with our endorsement in mind. So, we say, we want to work with you. We want to work with you on policy. We also want to donate $5,000 to your campaign. We also have 3 interns who are each going to spend 2 hours a week making calls for you to voters, mobilizing people to vote for you in your district. That is really powerful. Average member of Congress is maybe 10 dedicated volunteers. That's about it. So, when one of those volunteers is someone that is there for the reason of global development, because this is their issue set, because we want to see these programs fully funded and expanded, that makes a big difference. And that has not existed before in the foreign aid space. So that's kind of what we do. If you're interested in getting involved or applying for an internship, please email me. Even if you just want to join a 15-minute meeting with your member of Congress virtually. And keep in mind, you'll have Alexius or myself or other policy experts joining the meeting. So all we're really asking you to do is speak for 30 seconds or a minute. Say, hey, my name's Asher from Florida. I care about foreign aid because, I think it's the right thing to do. I think it's important to save lives. You can join a meeting. You can say that. You do not have to be the most articulate, the most in-depth person. There are other people on the call. The most important thing about these meetings is that there is a constituent there and that they see one of their voters cares about this issue and is taking not only the 15 minutes, because they understand this is, more of a process out of their day to meet with them. That has a really, really, really big impact on how they vote. So if you'd like to participate, in any of these things, and I encourage you to do it now so you don't forget. Just take out your phone. Or also, if you are writing a paper anyway for your global development class or any other class you're taking, or you have to write a thesis anyway, or a capstone project or anything like that, and instead of just sending it to your professor, you'd like it to be shared with 10,000 congressional staffers, or you'd like it to shape the future of global development work, you can also just send it to me, and it'll probably be included in our materials that we send out. But yeah, so send me an email, Asher, ASHER, Moss, MOSS, at the number 4, AL.org. And if you just send me the email now, just so I have your name and email and such. But if you want to follow up on that email with who your member of Congress is, whether you would like to intern, and if so, kind of what your congressional district is, or yeah, I said who your member of Congress is, whether you would like to intern, and if so, what area you want to specialize in. So, policy, communications, or elections. Send that my way. You can attach your resume too if you want. And I will definitely get back to you. Cool. Also, a final thing, if we have anyone who's really motivated in this room, I'm trying to open campus chapters of the Alliance for American Leadership. Is anyone kind of interested in student organizing? And I can say Alexius, who's a professor here, who's in the back, will definitely be like the faculty sponsor for it and help you set it up and mentor you and such. Just anyone passionate enough to start a campus chapter. Awesome. Cool. So note that when you reach out to me, and remind me, what's your name again? Ravina. Cool. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Yeah. And, we're still kind of looking through what a campus chapter is going to look like. We're starting one up at Boston University and a few other places. But, I think you can bring in speakers about this. You can organize people to meet with their members of Congress. What I really like to do is if we can get more people in a room and invite John Ossoff, and, or his staff or other members of Congress here to speak about this issue, that would be great. Ossoff, he votes the right way on this, but he doesn't show any passion about it because he thinks no one cares about it and he's trying to win an election. And we need to show him that there is a constituency that cares a lot about foreign aid and that, yes, appeal on the other issues, but don't forget this one. This one matters too to Georgia. And so, I would love to get a crowd together, invite him to speak about this. And see what we can organize, see how we can get people involved. Does anyone have any questions about interning at the Alliance or about any of the sort of work that we do? Yeah.
I know you mentioned how a lot of the work that you guys were doing or that USID was doing or it was doing affected the local grassroots here in Georgia. Do you guys have a department that specifically helps grassroots nonprofits or helps, I guess, farmers or just people just get involved with foreign policy or just foreign stuff like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one of our partners, Aid on the Hill, put together these briefs on which companies, nonprofits, farmers lost contracts or money in which states. Georgia was one of the most highly impacted states. We need to do more outreach to those folks, to be honest. And I wish there was a bigger reaction from farmers and from the Christian community and from other, NGOs and other recipients. So, if you've done that kind of work before and you want to be involved with that kind of local activism, going beneficiary to beneficiary. I mean, we have the list of them, but then finding their contact information and being hey, would you meet with your member of Congress about this? I think that kind of work is super important. And, that's like the kind of constituency we'd want to mobilize here in Georgia to actually put pressure on us up in Warnock and others to restore these programs. And note that when you, nice. Yeah.
I was just wondering what you find that to be the biggest like pushbacks or arguments that you get either from policymakers or from constituents. Like, what arguments are people using to advocate like that USAID doesn't come back or that it comes back like vastly reduced or different?
Yeah. So people believe we should spend money in the U.S., not overseas. And listen, the polling is that Americans believe we spend 25% of our budget on foreign aid. Again, it's significantly less than 1%. If you start out with the assumption that we're spending a quarter of our budget overseas, all of a sudden opposing foreign aid makes a lot of sense. Because then you're like, a quarter of our budget, we could fix the roads, we could get, healthcare. There's so much we could do with that. Why are we sending that all to people overseas? So explaining that basic fact is very important. The second pushback is, USAID was corrupt. And I think, explaining the partners that USAID worked with, the people like Catholic Relief Services, explaining this money got to people in need. We don't usually do this, but sometimes if people are bringing up like rebuttals, going through each case and explaining how that was not how it was presented by Doge. I'll give an example. Did anyone hear the story that, we're spending money on condoms for Hamas? Does anyone know the real story behind that? So the money was not even going to Gaza. There's a city in Africa called Gaza. And they were getting money for HIV/AIDS relief. And somehow the administration takes $10 million for the city of Gaza for HIV/AIDS relief and says, no, that's the Gaza and Israel-Palestine. And no, that's really just, condoms for a terrorist group. And it's ridiculous. And if you go through individually every single one of these examples Doge was citing, what you'll find is that each was more ridiculous than the last. And they're all like sort of based in some like rewrite of the truth that you would have to like put through AI 10 times to get to. But they're all just like extraordinarily ridiculous. And, I think it's important to explain that, sometimes and say, yes, there were inefficiencies. I mean, one of the big problems with USAID, and this is a legitimate problem, was that a lot of the money was going to large contractors and nonprofits instead of small players on the ground. And that kind of process leads to some money getting spent on administration and compliance costs and waste. But then you have to ask yourself, okay, why is that problem happening? And it's because Congress has put in place such intense reporting requirements for every single USAID contract. 27 reviews before the project even gets off the line. And then after the project, a million more to go through. And so if you were to reduce that paperwork requirement a bit, one, you would not have to have so many people at USAID working in compliance. Actually, the majority of USAID staff were compliance officers. And two, you could actually start to give money to, that local NGO on the ground that's able to implement it more effectively. Instead of give money to a big contractor that's based in DC and is then going to fill out all that paperwork and then give that money to that same NGO on the ground after taking their 20% cut. So there are problems. Like there are things we have to work through. But a lot of those problems go back to how Congress wrote the laws. And it wasn't necessarily like the civil servants at USAID, wasn't necessarily their fault. And if you had a productive conversation about how to reform these laws, how to make them better, and that's conversations we're having on the Hill, those are policy briefs, we've written and want to write more of, that's important. And that starts to turn the tide a little bit.